partecipanti sono pregati di prendere posto in sala, la conferenza sta per iniziare. Participants are kindly asked to take their seats. The conference is about to start. Tous les participants sont priés de prendre place dans la salle. La conférence va bientôt commencer.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Minister, Deputy Minister, Chair of the Italian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you all here for the 59th edition of Africa Day. And as you know, the last two editions took place online, and the themes were music and figurative arts. This year, we've decided to focus on African cultural literature. And we have here writers of international renown and writers of African origin who write in Italian. The theme was also chosen given the prestigious prizes awarded to writers of African origin in 2021, including the Nobel for Literature awarded to the Tanzanian Abdul Razak Gurnah and the prestigious French literary prize Goncourt won by the Senegalese Mohamed Mougassar. And there are other celebrations in addition to this conference tomorrow. We will continue with an event in partnership with the Libraries of Rome. It will focus on the contribution to Italian literature given by authors of African descent at the Nelson Mandela Library. And there'll be a webinar organized by the Italian Institute of Culture in Dakar, Pretoria, and Addis Ababa. And there will be university professors giving presentations as experts of African literature. I would like to thank the African Centre of Study of Turin, where we will be followed by streaming. I would like to thank you all for having joined us, and in particular, I would like to acknowledge the presence of so many prestigious speakers. And now it is a pleasure to give the floor to the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Luigi Di Maio. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome you all, dear Mr. Mistretta. I am delighted to be here. I would like to greet the chair of the Italian Senate's Foreign Affairs Committee, Ms. Crazzi, and all of the ambassadors and friends present here today. And it is a real joy to be able to welcome you all here at the Farnesina. It is a pleasure to be able to celebrate the 59th anniversary of the foundation of the Organization of African Union, which in 2002 became the African Union. As you know, we have devoted our prior editions to music and figurative arts. Today, we have chosen to focus on literature, which is, of course, an important part of the African cultural scene. Art and culture have always been an instrument to promote understanding and cooperation among different peoples, and this is why, in this spirit, we have decided to give the celebrations a cultural focus in line with the agenda of the African Union for 2063, and we obviously focus on shared values and ethical principles. African cultural heritage is precious asset, and it represents the inextricable tie between past and present generations. Literature is possibly the instrument through which we have the expression of a Pan-African ideal, a united continent which pursues common goals. New African writers are contributing to attaining this goal, and their works are known all over the world. They describe the new Africa, and they therefore accompany this narrative, which goes beyond prejudice, bias, and stereotypes. The decision to focus on literature for Africa Day 2022 is also a signal. It as we know, a bond between Italy and Africa. We know that the work of the diaspora and the writing of writers of African descent who write in Italian is a way of enriching our common cultural heritage with new words and with new visions. We also, of course, want to ensure that there is adequate protection for our cultural heritage, and we make available our vocation in the area of cultural heritage, its protection, and we have the necessary skills to ensure that these valuable assets are always adequately enhanced. We obviously believe in a partnership on equal footing for a shared, sustainable route towards development, which we intend to support and pursue together with African countries. Published in December 2020, this strategic document has, in fact, opened the way for a new era. During our presidency of the G20 and our partnership with the UK for COP26, we focused specifically on Africa in connection with the main themes. I would like to mention the session of the ministerial meeting in June 2020 in Matera. The foreign ministers focused on Africa on that occasion, and our attention on Africa will continue this year, as we did for the G20 meetings within the framework of our presidency within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We will organize a session on Africa during the ministerial meeting, which will be held on the 9th and 10th of June in Paris. Today, we have to consolidate our bonds with African partners. International cooperation is fundamental in order to adequately tackle the global challenges facing the continent, which, as we know, obviously compounded by the tragic consequences of the war in Ukraine, which are spreading far beyond Europe. Examples are terrorism, the impact of climate change, food insecurity, and we know that the economic repercussions of the Russian aggression in Ukraine is compounding these issues. Given the priority that Italy's foreign policy attributes to Africa, I would like to mention some initiatives that we have recently promoted in order to find common answers to these threats. Firstly, we proposed that an Africa-focused group be established within the framework of the Anti-Daesh Global Coalition, which met on the 11th of May during the Marrakesh ministerial meeting. We want to support African partners in bolstering their capabilities to combat violent extremism and terrorism, whilst recognizing their full ownership. And in addition to energy and climate diplomacy, which is pursued together with our African partners, Italy has devoted the third edition of the Italy-Africa conference, Meetings with Africa, which was held in October 2021, focusing on climate and the environment, sustainable transition, green finance, inclusion of our territories, of women and youth in sustainable development processes. We know that we're obviously focusing on a twin transition that has to be green and digital, and we do this in our partnership with Africa. And this is, amongst other things, that one of the pillars of Italy's candidacy for the Expo 2030. And the theme is people, territories, urban regeneration, inclusion, and innovation. The 2030 Expo that Rome hopes to host is not a target, but it is a process that we want to pursue with other partners, a laboratory for ideas and projects that we want to implement together. And there's a third initiative, which I announced when I attended on the 18th of May in New York, the Global Food Security Call to Action, which was convened by Secretary of State Blinken and co-chaired by the UN Secretary General Guterres, is to be seen within the framework of the Global Alliance for Food Security, launched by G7 countries that Italy is committed to. Together with the German presidency of the G7 and with FAO on the 8th of June, we will be organizing a ministerial dialogue with Mediterranean countries so as to better understand the needs of the countries most affected by the food crisis caused by the war in Ukraine, so as to identify appropriate actions. In conclusion, the partnership between Italy and Africa is based on solid and lasting roots, because we believe firmly that the fate of the two shores of the Mediterranean is shared, and there can be a prosperous future only if it is shared by African and European peoples. And it is in the spirit that I would like to wish you all the best for these Africa Day celebrations, wishing you a successful meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. Now, I would like to call on the Ambassador of Senegal, His Excellency Papa Abdoulaye Seck. Senegal is holding the current presidency of the African Union. And then the Foreign Minister, once the Ambassador has finished his presentation, will have to leave us due to other institutional engagements. Over to you, Ambassador. Thank you very much, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy, Ms. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy, ambassadors, writers from Italy, France, and Africa present here today, dear guests. I think I have successfully greeted all according to the protocol. In the name of His Excellency Maxel, President of the Republic of Senegal, currently President of the African Union, this morning, here in Rome, it is for me a great pleasure to be able to attend this extremely important ceremony, which we owe to Italy, a country characterized by millennial cultural heritage. I'm also pleased to note that here in Rome, in 1959, the second conference of Black writers and artists took place following the first edition, which was held in Paris. Consequently, today's ceremony is to be considered as a clear indication of Italy's will to continue to consolidate and expand the strong bonds it has with the African continent. Mr. Minister, ladies and gentlemen, in a famous address delivered in 1962, Giorgio La Pira, at the time mayor of Florence, actually quoted the words of the President poet Senegal, and I quote, "A people which refuses the meeting with history, which does not believe it bears a unified message, is doomed, and it deserves to be placed in a museum." End of quote. We know that within the framework of this relationship, literature is to be considered as one of the key pillars in a world that is, as we know, increasingly interdependent, and this makes for even stronger solidarity. And yes, our President Poet was right, and I will quote once again, "Pride of being different should not prevent us from enjoying the happiness of togetherness." In other words, we need to, in fact, consolidate our will to live together on this planet. And we therefore have to acknowledge the universal nature of civilization, which must, of course, respect differences, but must also make the most of every individual's contribution that together can make this a better world. We have to nourish the world without destroying it, and we have to pursue global development, which requires that there be harmony and union in the name of the right of all people to be entitled to sustainable progress and development. Minister, ladies and gentlemen, such an opportunity must not be missed. And this enables us once again to pay a fitting tribute to the early African writers who, in fact, gave the world an excellent image of our continent, contributing to a better understanding and making it possible to contribute to opportunities for development in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that today we have some brilliant writers, and we know that African youth are fully aware of the challenges lying ahead and the questions that need to be answered. And when mentioning these young writers in particular, we must mention and acknowledge Mr. Mohamed Mbougar Sarr, who won the prestigious Prix Goncourt in 2021. And this is an opportunity for me to once again reiterate the congratulations expressed by our President Macky Sall, and we are extremely proud of his achievement. And we know that his work is absolutely immense and incredibly relevant. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the Republic of Senegal currently holds the presidency of the African Union. When he was sworn into his position, said that everything must be done and no effort must be spared to ensure that culture occupies the place it deserves. And by the same token, no effort should be spared so that Africa can recover the integrity of its cultural heritage, because we know that culture is the soul of a people, and it is a priceless treasure that can never be replaced. As I approach the end of my address, Mr. Minister, I would like to end by thanking the Italian government and the Italian people for having always been so close to our continent, for the mutually beneficial cooperation that this leads to, and this is for everyone's benefit and enjoyment. I wish you all the very best on behalf of His Excellency Macky Sall, President of the Republic of Senegal and currently President of the African Union. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Grazie ambasciatore. Come preannunziato,
Thank you, Ambassador. And as mentioned previously, Minister Di Maio will have to leave us for his other engagements, and I am happy to introduce Vice Deputy Minister Sereni, who will remain with us. After this first institutional session introduction, let's move on to the focus of today's conference. And I am happy to now give the floor to Ms. Veronica Fernandez, who is a journalist for RAI, the National Radio and TV Broadcasting Company, and who will be moderating this morning's session with our esteemed guests, who are the protagonists of this day. Thank you, Director, and thank you everyone for organizing this conference. And as Director Mistretta mentioned, the protagonists of today are our writers. We have Chiara Piaggio and Iga Bashego, who will tell us about the mosaic of literature and which they curated. And then we have Sami Chak, Atzafilali, Gada Al. We have another writer who is connected remotely from Johannesburg. And then on the other side, on my left, we have Papkuma, Iwande, Omotoso, and Esperance Hakazimuawa. And then we will have our closing remarks with the Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, Marina Sereni. Director Mistretta introduced this conference by saying that this year African writers were awarded many prestigious prizes and mentioned the Nobel Prize and the Goncourt Prize and the Camões Prize in Portuguese language, among others. With these awards, there was a renewed interest in African culture, African literature, the African continent, and everything that literature entails. And I am happy to recall today that African literatures never stopped existing. It never stopped telling their story, the story of this continent. And this literature, the literature of African continent, didn't only begin with the recognition and awarding of these prizes. And literature, but not only, are trying to describe the complexity and the imagination of a world that are not necessarily so easily accessible. So these awards have opened up uh, a world to learn about these writers, learn about their stories and their storytelling, and has refocused our attention on linguistic choices. We know that there are numerous languages in the African continent, and the entire system of the publishing system in the continent and its veering towards the European continent. These are all issues that through literature are becoming of more of interest. So Igabashego curated the anthology of African literature, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, and Chiara Piaggio is also promoting the literature of this continent all over the world. So I will leave the floor to her. Good morning and thank you. Yes, as you mentioned, last year African literature imposed itself on the international scene. But as Veronica Fernandez was saying, this is not a success that came out of nowhere. This is a long process that began in pre and post-colonial era, and over the past 2 decades has seen an exponential growth in the number of African writers, and of course the incredible qualities, literary qualities of these writers have told the story of an Africa that for many years was told from an Eastern point of view, and not from a point of view from within Africa, that describes itself through its narrative and depicts itself very differently from how it was previously described, and is also able to now express its perspective, its point of view on other parts of the world. It doesn't necessarily only talk about Africa, but it also talks about other countries and other continents and other regions. So if we consider all the prizes that were mentioned earlier, one thing stands out. One thing in particular is that these awards are all awarded within the European sphere, Eastern sphere. And these awards are very often awarded to Eastern writers and who are published and write in the Western world. And African literature has gone through a very peculiar journey. And this aspect isn't to be taken for granted. Africa is the continent with the greatest variety of languages. There are more than 1,500 languages. Some people state there are more than 3,000, but 90% of these languages are languages that are spoken by a minority, by less than 10,000 people. So institutional languages, so the language of education, the language that are often used by writers, very often are not their mother tongue, but they are Western languages. So if we don't consider Arab countries, I'm referring specifically to French, English, and Portuguese. So for many years, African writers considered publishing in the Western world because that meant having access to a more structured uh, world and having a broader audience. And this inverted the journey of a writer, who's usually known within his country and then outside of its borders. For African writers, often the opposite happens. They are known internationally, and then afterwards they are uh, recognized within their country. And dealing with a foreign public is not necessarily natural, who doesn't have a similar cultural background and often has different expectations when reading a book or a novel written by an African author. And this is an aspect that many authors have had to deal with in the past. And this has led to a strong debate on what African literature is. Who are the writers that can be considered within this group of African writers, or necessarily do they have to be writers who are born and live in Africa? Some consider that writers should go back to writing in their local languages. Some are doing that. Some are translating their novels in the local language to be more accessible. They've introduced new terminology like Afropolitarian to introduce and to describe this new world of African writers who live abroad, who live all over the world. If we consider what is happening nowadays in the African continent, we realize that things are starting to change. Not all countries are the same. Some countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Algeria, and others who are a driving force in the sector, and there are publishing houses that are being created in many countries. There are other that are have been there for many years. For example, Cassava Republic Press in Nigeria, which was created in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, to bring back to Africa African literature, to bring back African literature to its roots, back to its roots. And of course, we mustn't neglect digitization, which is contributing significantly. Africa is very digitized, and this is having an impact on the literary industry. There are books that are published directly in the digital form. There are literary blogs that are so successful There are literary magazines, online literary magazines that offer a new platform for writers to be known. There are festivals that are carried out only solely online. And all of this is, of course, encouraging the emergence of a new generation of writers, but on the other hand, is also leading to a step back in some way. Some well-established authors in the Western world are going back and on their steps and uh, producing and writing in Africa. And this is very interesting because when this occurs, it occurs from the awareness that they're trying to stop this paradox that African publishing houses are very often forced to buy the rights of African authors. And today we will have our guests and we will be discussing this broad world, the world of literature and African literature in particular. Thank you, Chiara, for your insight. On the one hand, the management of rights, and then learning about the digitized world in the literary sector. And we've heard from Chiara that many authors are very active online and have access to a new public. African literature and authors and authors of African descent have incredibly changed this scenario. And Sami Chak will um, recount the story and the steps and the process of African literature. And we also have with us Azza Filali and Gada Abdel Al, and we will hear about this literature that is less known. So I'm going to ask Sami Chak what the steps in this process of renewed interest in African literature have been. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Veronica, and thank you to the organizers. Literature is a combination of bodies and souls and is stems from languages, the languages that we speak. And very often when we think about Africa and African descent in and I notice this very often when I travel, we don't often think about Italy. We think about British authors, French authors, German authors, but many don't know that there is a strong Italian literature that is written by Italian authors, and that is also because African presence in Italy is long-standing, but isn't always known. We are in Rome today. Rome has also had very um, important African authors, and even just by walking through the city or any other Italian city, we can see traces of Africa and African descent in Italy, and not only the heritage of slaves, but also Alessandro de' Medici, who was of the Medici family, Saint San Benedetto il Moro. The more he spoke a dialect, and he spoke a little bit like Esperance in some way. If we think about the Carpaccio gondolier, then if we think about even Santa Maria Maggiore, the first African author in Italy is buried there. When the president of the republic hosts African delegations, Ngunda's up there, and is watching. And so all of these elements lead to literature. Literature stems from this strong presence in this country. And of course, it starts with immigration. Immigration started in the 70s, but already back in the 50s, there were many African students in Italy from Somalia, from Sudan, from Ethiopia. And this has led to the creation of literature. Papkuma was the first, but before him there was Antonio Campobasso. Campobasso was a son of the war, and he wrote a novel entitled The Nero di Puglia. Uh, and and spoke about being an person of African descent in Puglia and retelling the story of who his father was, who his mother was, and the story of discrimination, because very often, and this applies more to European literature of African descent, there is the retelling of discrimination and of North African or sub-Saharan African people who had to fight to express themselves. So Antonio Campobasso links back to um, British authors like Carol Phillips and Papkuma. And then we have Papkuma, who will be speaking shortly. We have with us part of African literature and the history of African literature with us today, and we had to fight um, against a series of definitions and terminology that has been attributed to us. But authors, first generation authors, so Pap, but also Cosimon, Lemmy, they decided to write in the Italian language, using the Italian language. They could have chosen to write in French or in English, but they deliberately chose to write in Italian because that was a way to communicate with this country, talk and express about the plurality of this country. And migrants who arrived in the 70s had many children. I am a daughter of these migrants, and many others who are younger than me are writing. They're starting to write, and the themes that stem from this storytelling is slightly different from first generation immigrants, because in the first generation there was more of a need to talk about uh, returning to Africa and describing this journey abroad. But in second generation writers, there was more a search for identity. Where do I come from? Where am I going? I've asked myself that question myself many times. I'm the daughter of two Somalians, and I've asked myself these questions. Maybe these are uh, things that we will never solve because we feel many things. We're not just one person. We have, like I said, we have Esperance with us today, and she will tell us her story. But Cristina Lifara, who wrote a beautiful novel. Gabriele Armandi, who spoke about the whole colonial uh, issue, and we also have Jara Khan today, who describes this double perspective, south-south, or Paco Benhamed, who uses literature but also cartoons to tell his stories, cartoons. So we have a very rich literature here in Italy. So I will just end by saying that Italian publishing industry should believe in African literature more, because African writers have always had a very tormented journey, and even very tormented in the way they've wanted to describe and tell their history and their story, because Italy is also Africa. And I have a friend who is a professor at La Sapienza, and she always reminds me that the closest capital to Rome is Tunis. So we have to start global communication and an Italo-African dialogue, equal dialogue, where culture can be at the center of this dialogue. Thank you.
Giova ha compiuto il miracolo di riassumere
Well, it's extraordinary how in a few minutes you're able to summarize decades of literature. We should take due note. In addition to all of these very insightful comments, you rightly pointed out that at times when a presence is invisible, there are a number of difficulties, and this is tied up neatly with what was said regarding the difficulty of publishing. So you have given us, let's say, the big picture with respect to African literature and the work of African writers in Italy. We now will hear from a panel of writers who will share their vision of the world, and we will kick off with a video interview by Chiara Piaggio with the writer Mohamed Garsa, who won the Prix Goncourt. He's going to tell us about the impact of winning such a prestigious award, and he will also share with us his vision of the world and literature. So we will start by seeing this video into a good morning. Very, very pleased to be with Mohamed Mbougar Sarr, who won the Goncourt Prize in 2021 with a book that is actually about African literature. And he explores the story of two writers with a different say path. What was your vision and what was your purpose? I wanted to reflect on the meaning of literature to start with, but this is done from the point of view of an African writer and African literary tradition, which of course is part of the global tradition of literature, but also part of global history. And my purpose was that of indicating that African writers are entitled, let's say, to occupy a place in this history. It was interesting for me to see how they were educated, how they were received globally, how readers, let's say, in the West appreciated their work. And obviously, we know that this is of interest with respect to, let's say, the possible prejudice and bias or caricature that at times can accompany this perception of the West vis-a-vis Africa and African writers. There can be bias, in fact. So the story is based on a real story, that of the Malian writer who was very successful in 1968 with his first novel, and then he was accused of plagiarism, and this was a very difficult time for him. And I have, in fact, transposed this geographically. This was just an inspiration, of course, for my work. And we can see in my book what he experienced and that of other writers, including the first black winner of the Goncourt Prize. In addition to these political matters, the purpose is that of focusing on the meaning of our engagement with literature and the many, many exploration that can be triggered by literature, including exploration of our own soul. Last year was a very special one for African literature. We know that the most important literary prizes in the world were awarded to African writers, including yourself. Do you think that this is going to actually have an impact on the future of African literature, on its fate? Well, I think that certainly this is bound to have an impact, but we mustn't simply think of the impact deriving from an award, which is as if by magic going to transform Africa into the greatest literary continent in the world. It's not as straightforward as that. Clearly, that could also be a case of a one shot, and then everything would go back to business as usual. However, we have to consider that there is a Western dominion with respect to literature. This is also the case, or if we think about the awards given, which are Western awards, albeit given to African writers. Therefore, Africa must try and focus on the entire world of literature, writers, publishers, and we need a literary ecosystem. It has to be solid, sustainable, stimulating, and that could be the breeding ground for new writers and also for major literary prizes that could, let's say, bring greater prominence into greater prominence the African literary scene. Obviously, it's important to obtain recognition from abroad, but it is even more important for recognition to be granted from within. And we don't have that at the moment. We have great writers, great works of literature. We don't have, let's say, an institutional ecosystem at the moment. And hopefully these prizes will symbolically, let's say, trigger this process. It is my wish. Thank you. And it is my wish too. Well, the interview by Chiara actually covered a lot of issues that we'll be examining today. The role of the writer, the symbolic significance of recognition. And now I would like to ask Sami Chak to express his view. We've said how hard it is for a writer to be labeled. We know that Sami was born in Togo, now lives in France. He's a philosopher, not just a writer, one of the most influential figures. And his last book is Le Continent du tout et presque du rien. And we're hopefully going to see this published in Italy. Now, I wonder if you could help us understand. I know that you have often explored the multifaceted characteristics of African writers. We know that at times African writers tend to be constrained within certain themes, and this is very reductive because it means that there is only reference made to certain places or certain characteristics, such as the color of the skin, and these are themes that have figured in your work. So I'm wondering whether you could comment on this, also in the light of the important awards that have recently been given to African writers. This raises a number of questions, and I imagine that writers will have to see how to relate to all of this. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Well, it is extremely difficult. There's been a lot of talk about African literature, and I'm going to try and do things differently. I'm going to mention names of African writers without indicating or what country they're from and what period they live in. Katia Bassim, Boyo Antongo, Mouredil Farah, Maria Mbaba, Ben Nukri, Senila Boutansi, Mouloud Feraoun, Yango Ologe, Nadine Gordima, Asia Jiba, Aikwe Arma, Albert Mimi, Ken Bugur, Miakutu, Tatilata, Aminata Sofal, Onjaki. Well, I didn't mention all those who were awarded Nobel Prizes, 5 in all: Abdul Razak Gurna, John Maxwell Coetzee, Nadine Gordimer, Naguib Mahfouz, Oleshenka. Now, this list, I think, shows how it's very challenging to talk about African literature. What are we talking about? I've mentioned a list of writers who've written in Arabic, English, Portuguese, and French. I could have included others who've written books in Swahili, in Ingala, in Wolof. But are we talking about, in fact, when we say African literature? Because we're talking about a whole continent. What do we mean exactly when, as we've heard, we actually ignore what African writers publish in Italy? We're not familiar with their work at all. In 2008 or 9 in Mantua, met for the first time African writers who publish in Italian. I didn't know them because I don't read Italian. So what exactly are we talking about? We're talking about African literature. This is a label that identifies literature, but in fact, this means that we fail to grasp the complexity of African writers. I read out a list. Some were awarded the Nobel Prize. However, when we leave so-called African space, i.e., the space inhabited by Africans and people specialized in African literature, such as Chiara Piaggio, who is an eminent not expert, when we leave that space, then the question could be put to very well-educated people. Could you please mention some great names of writers? Well, I bet you that nobody would ever mention an African writer. And I'm talking about well-educated people. Believe me, I doubt that if asked that question, i.e., names great African writers, nobody, I think, would think of great African writers. They might talk about Dante, Balzac, Elsa Morante, Dostoevsky. And what are we trying to say in 2021? Of course, African writers were awarded the Goncourt, the Neustadt, the Booker Prize, the Nobel Prize for Literature, and yet there is a problem which Mohamed Bougar Sarr mentioned. We are marginalized, in fact, within the Western system. And this marginalization is such that when we are, let's say, recognized and acknowledged, we might receive an important prize and we rejoice, but we wonder, how is it that we happen to be the only writers who can receive recognition and celebrate only if awarded a prize by the West? Ideally, a writer should write only for his or her people, irrespective of whether this writer is known elsewhere. And I would like to make reference to very specific examples. Before we became acquainted with Dante, he obviously was known here. We obviously knew that he was important for Italians, and because of that, he became important to us. But African writers are only the only ones, in fact, who are actually recognized by other countries and may or may not then become, let's say, well known in their own countries. In a way, they are made elsewhere. And in fact, clearly, I don't think that the Goncourt Prize or the Nobel Prize will change things. If we continue to be writers who are produced elsewhere, if we continue to be, let's say, characterized by this identity, we will continue to be marginalized. Mohamed Bougar Sarr quite rightly said that we should actually ask our politicians to show some greater interest. How can we have writers who will be eventually then recognized overseas? But they have to be considered as Elsa Morante was in Italy. Until we solve this, until we have recognition within Africa of the work of writers, we can continue talking about African literature, but we will forget that we're talking about Western marginal phenomena, because the African literature we're talking about is a marginal Western phenomenon. Thank you for your attention. Well, these considerations should make us change our approach, and it is something that will not easily be forgotten. We have to talk about, yes, of course, literature and the gaze upon the world that comes from literature. Another important theme is the link between literature and history. And Ijaba quite rightly pointed out that presence can be the source of literature. And there's also a lot to be said about the link between literature and history. And because of this, I would like to call on Adza Filiali, who is a writer and has published extensively also articles in the press. You have, in fact, written about contemporary issues and the colonial and post-colonial days. I would like to ask Asa Filiali to explain how literature can give us, let's say, a way of understanding our societies, past and present, let's say, a gaze on our history. Thank you very much, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to thank the organisers of this conference for having allowed me to attend today. I would like to go back to what Sami Chak was saying. Literature as a cultural form is actually due to a political commitment and choice. I'm not going to talk about themes as such, but I would like to focus on my writing, my career as a novelist and a doctor. In fact, was characterized by coup de foudre, and there's a deep challenging, generous link between my two careers. And there is a sort of dense osmosis between my work as a writer and my work as a doctor, and I continue to examine patients, and I therefore deal with their diseases, and we need in writing the same kind of precision. And in my texts, the body is not very far. I often, in fact, give what my characters an anomaly, which means the body is in let's say, the limelight. In the novel Watan, Mishket has two big feet, huge feet, compared to her body. In another text, Les Intranquilles, the skin of people speaks before their words do, and at times more than their words do. There are rashes, redness, and I would like to loss of smell, and that happened long before COVID. And I've also talked about and written about the aura of beings, and there's a lot of skin and flesh involved, and we can then explore the emotions that are the very essence of any being. And as other living Tunisian writers who live in Tunisia, my work in fact explored a society in motion. And we know that after the so-called Jasmine Revolution, it has been impossible to express, let's say, the new national narrative. In 1956, Habib Bourguiba and his comrades, after independence, embraced let's say, the path towards a modern country. Women removed their veils and they went to universities, becoming, in principle, citizens on an equal footing. In the 1960s, Tunisia was a great construction site, and love for our country led people to build a modern state on that basis. But this further lasted the space of a generation, or maybe 30 years or so. then globalization and laissez-faire had an impact on our country and on our literature. Before Islamism began to place its seal on conscience, we know that competition had already taken the upper hand, and we know that there was widespread malaise. There were young people who studied and they became unemployed, angry, and vengeful. And the Islamist wave, in fact, continued to bring the country down, and it ended up losing much of the ground gained in decades. How to explain this? I've asked myself, and this has not stopped me from writing. How can we tell stories that actually make you want other things and make you want to be different and act differently? Also, in terms of patriotism, literature, first and foremost for me, is an exercise in freedom, and characters can be taken anywhere the writer wishes them to be. We have a responsibility. We are writers of African countries that are often faced with a crisis, and we have the responsibility of leading people to doubt evidence, to let them enjoy other things, a different gaze, different values, new possibilities. Through my latest work, I have concentrated on people to the detriment of social issues, because I believe that the state of society can best be understood by exploring the deep seated feelings. In Bref, séjour au paradis, main character has to face the death of a young girl, and this young woman represents Tunisia. And my character, who carries out the investigation into her death, identifies a network which goes beyond the country's borders, aimed at let's say, doing away with the damned of the earth, one could say, or those who are considered as being unnecessary. My text explores the torments of my country in this way. And I would like to end by saying a few words about the relations between Italy and Tunisia. As you all know, every day Africans try to cross the sea to reach Italy, the door to Europe, which can give them mental and material well-being. And we know that only too often these travels are cut short, either because their boats are capsized or because as soon as they arrive, these people are sent back to where they came from. There have been instances of coexistence, and in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an integrated, active, loved, Tunisified community of Italians, and we still remember this, and it shows us that other kinds of relations are possible and are desirable. We know that camps that host refugees often are not temporary, but they are a place where people spend their lives. I would like to end with a happier image at La Boulette, which is where Italians used to live in Tunis. On the 15th of August, we celebrated the Day of the Virgin Mary, the end of the bathing season, and there was a procession with a statue of the Virgin Mary, which was acclaimed by the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews with the same enthusiasm. This common enthusiasm shared by people who overcame all differences and were just happy together is how I would like to end my remarks. Thank you very much for your invitation.
Grazie per averci appunto.
Thank you for describing these links with the past and this contemporary phase. And you mentioned a phrase which I will pick up on to continue on with this morning's debate, and in particular focusing on the complexity of the work of writers and authors. So I would like to ask Gada Abdel Al to focus on gender studies. You started off as a blogger and then as a writer. So I would like to ask you how you can guide us in choosing a style to tell a story, to describe and depict all the different dynamics and nuances that we can express to our public.
Thank you for inviting me to this conference. For some reason, we don't have such conferences in Egypt about African literature, which is very strange because we are an African nation. But I'm very pleased that I was really educated today by hearing my fellow writers. Gender issues in my country is very sensitive. It's very difficult to be born a girl in Africa, and it's more difficult to be born a girl in Africa and in the Arab world. Gender issues always clashes for some reason with religion. People think that these two things are against each other. If you are talking about women's rights or issues, then you are clashing with religion. Religion is the base for our laws, for our customs, for our tradition. So it's very difficult to write about this issue. And it's even more difficult if you're a woman. I was called I was described as bold and brave for the simple reason of talking about issues that only important for me or that belongs to me. We are raised to be good girls, and being a good girl in my country means that you should be quiet. It's better if you are silent. So when you talk about your issues and you raise your voice, you're not considered a good girl. So I've been enjoying this reputation for the last 16 years since I started my blog. I was I chose a style of writing um, to make me be able to write about this issue for so long without being silenced. I chose a satirical style. I chose comedy. I started with a blog in 2006, and last year I wrote a screenplay for a TV series in Netflix that became in the top 10 list in 10 countries for 8 weeks. So I think I've done a fair job in doing that. People receive what I write in a way that is because simply I use the style of asking people to discuss or to understand or to put themselves in our shoes. It's not very easy to talk about these subjects in public. I mean, even though in what we had lots of discussions about several issues in the time of the revolution in 2010, but we were asked to dismiss the call for women's rights because we will anger the revolution's supporters. Even in the cultural scene, the male dominance is frightening. I was asked so many times, are you really planning to write another book? Isn't one enough? So just by being able to discuss these issues in blogs, in papers, in magazine, in screenplays for so long, I feel it's a privilege because that's the way I was raised. I was raised to speak up, which is very difficult for so many people and that's the thing that I'm always amazed by. Only that you are supposed to not talk about your issues or write about them, but I take this privilege as a responsibility, and I will try to just keep discussing these stories, these articles, these issues until the end of my career, and I will be very honored if I can do so. Thank you.
Grazie per averci raccontato che cosa vuol dire nel suo lavoro quotidiano, appunto.
Thank you for describing the difficulties of your everyday work and the limitations that you encounter in telling these stories and dealing with these issues. I will like to introduce Yowande Omotoso. She is connected virtually from South Africa. And her latest book is being published by a publishing house, Cassava Republic, which Chiara Piaggio mentioned, and describes the mourning of a mother who tries to live the life of her daughter. So it's a very touching story linked to identity and the search for identity. And today we would like to talk about to Yuande about multiple personalities as people, but also as writers, and how her life and her work as a writer has impacted her personal life. So I will ask her this question in English.
The desire of being always connected to our roots or to a specific place or a specific community. So how important are those two aspects for you as a writer? Thank you. Penso che non si senta.
We cannot hear you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me? But we can't hear you. It looks like we can't hear you. Vogliamo forse proseguire con il prossimo?
Maybe we can move on to our next speaker, and then that way we can give Yowanda time to connect and try out the microphone. So while we wait for Yowanda to connect and fix her microphone, we can move on and talk about the other side of literature and literature writers of African descent and the diasporas that we have here in Italy. Ijaba mentioned already the difficulties that this literature and these writers have had to encounter, and she mentioned the role of Pap Kuma, and we've known Pap for many years. We met in Milan, and having followed your career as a writer, I would like to ask you today about an exceptional idea that you had, which is translating Dante, which is a huge endeavor and led to many nightmares and sleepless nights. So I would like to ask you, when did you come up with this idea, and what impact did it have on the public? Good morning, everyone, and thank you, the organizers of this conference. I would like to thank the ministry, the minister, deputy minister, all ambassadors present here today, or to moderators, and experts, and my colleagues, writers and authors who are here with us this morning. I will answer your question first. But before that, I would like to point out that I was born and I went to school in French schools, and Wolof is my language. But when they asked me, what language do you want to study in when you grow up, I said I want to learn and speak the language of Dante. Having never learned this language, I walked around the streets and learned the language of Dante that way. So it was not an easy journey. It wasn't easy to write in the language of Dante, expecting to produce literature in a language that wasn't my language and that I learned in the streets, that I'm still learning. So why translate Dante into Wolof? It was to build a bridge between not necessarily Italy and Senegal, but between Italy and Africa, because we are here as writers, but we are also here as a mirror of this country. We're cultural ambassadors, as it were, and we speak of Africa, we speak of our country of origin, our continent of origin, but we also speak of and describe our hosting country. I visited Italy more than I visited Senegal. I lived in Senegal for 22 years and I've been in Italy for 40 years. So there's a significant difference and time spent in these two countries. So I belong to these two countries and these two cultures, and the role of many of us authors present here today is to build bridges. That is what I tried to do. That was what I was hoping to accomplish when the Dakar Cultural Institute asked me, on the occasion of the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante, asked me to translate the uh, first canto of the Inferno by Dante. Sami Chuck mentioned the concept of African author. I don't exist as an author in Africa or in Senegal because I write in Italian, which is a language that is not spoken or read in Senegal. And when my friends in Dakar asked me, "What do you do in Italy?" I said, "I write books." Well, they just look at me and move on because it's unimaginable. I am a writer in Italy. Because I write in Italian, because I write in the language of Dante. So translating Dante is for me returning to my origins. So what impact did this translation of Dante have on me? And here I will mention Umberto Eco, who said that translation is a process of negotiation that is preceded by interpretation of meaning. And the language of Dante, and we're referring to the 1300s, and the language that is currently spoken in my language are very different. And I'm not talking about the Italian that is spoken now, I'm talking about the Italian that was spoken by Dante, is very different. Dante, I also found out, was translated for the first time in a language of Western Africa. Dante was translated into Swahili and many other languages, even in Afrikaans. But this is the first time that he's being translated in a Western African country. And in Nigeria, they are also translating Dante, I've recently found out. So I will mention a few examples of when I worked on this translation. And I'm no linguist, I am simply a narrator. And I had to consult specialists, and I thank one of them, Professor Cristiana Brunetti from the Sapienza University. She is here today, and she helped me greatly, and I would like to thank her. So, considering the strictly allegoric connotation and the specificities of the first canto of the Inferno by Dante, I had to necessarily consider some linguistic aspects and cultural aspects and focus on the rendering of these forms in consideration of the fact that this was a poetic translation. And these elements were semantic and necessary. And if I consider the different languages, the different eras, and the different languages, I also had to deal with linguistic difficulties, specifically the wolf. To give you an example, when Dante speaks of the wolf, and he refers to the mountain in Senegal, I verified that we don't have wolves in Senegal. And there are no mountains in the region, geographic region where the Wolof language developed. So there were no references that I could have used. And I had to find a way to translate translate the word wolf, which does not exist in the Wolof language because it does not exist in that region. How to translate the word mountain because it does not exist in the Wolof language because in that region of Africa and of the country, there is no such thing. Because there were these cultural aspects and references that I had to deal with. Dante speaks of the wolf in an allegoric way, and I had to use the word jackal, which is similar to the wolf, but in the Wolof language, we didn't have a term for wolf. We have many words in French. We use French words in many cases and very often. And if you ask a Senegalese the colors of the flag of Senegal, they will never answer in Wolof. They will answer in French. They will say green, red, and yellow. Even if those terms exist, they forget them. They don't use them. They're not commonly used. And so they use French naturally. And we have also an influence from the Arab world. We have very words in Arabic. We have a strong influence from the Portuguese language. The Portuguese were the first to arrive in Senegal. So even if I am not a linguist, I tried to eliminate as many Arabic words as possible, eliminate as many French words as possible, and Portuguese words. I tried my best, but I had to leave some words in because they were necessary. So, to conclude, I used a style, declamatory rhetoric, to remain as similar to Dante as possible. And there is also an oral literature as opposed to written literature. So I had to adapt the rhetoric to an oral literature in Wolof. And another example, just to give you another example, when Dante meets Virgil, I apologize to the translator, but I will say this in the language of Dante. When Dante meets Virgilio, and here I linked back to the oral rhetoric, when I saw him in the desert, maybe Virgilio is the source that will guide me to this wide river, as he responded, and will guide me towards my great love, who has made me search for you. You are my master. You are the only one who has given me honor. So to conclude, I had to skipped the interpretation of Dante in Italian. I have never read Dante in French. I wanted to start with the vulgar edition and end up directly in our Dante version, or Senegalese version of Dante. Thank you.
Grazie Papcom, io penso che sia un lavoro
Thank you very much for this fascinating and interesting presentation. And you quite rightly pointed out that there is a challenge when you're translating something that doesn't exist in the target country or language. I think we can go back to Yewande Omotozo. We were talking about latest novel and the issue of identity and how you can be rooted in different places.
desire of being connected to our roots and how important it is to delve into these aspects as for you as a person and also as a writer. So thank you very much for being here with us from Johannesburg.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay, good. Apologies for that. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and thank you to everybody who's present. And it's really good to share space and platform with my colleagues that spoke before me and that come after. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the problems when we speak about literature in this way is we box it very quickly when we attach it too firmly to geography. So yes, we can talk about African literature, but if you think a bit, I believe that it becomes a problem if that it feels too fixed. And maybe I'm the right person to kind of be an ambassador for that kind of way of thinking, because I'm from so many places. I was born on the island of Barbados, where my mother was from. I grew up in Nigeria, where my father is from, and I've spent most of my life in South Africa, where my children are born. And I studied architecture, and I've done many other things before I came to writing. So even professionally, and I work now today for Greenpeace International. So I mean, I'm somebody who I enjoy messing around and bothering the borders and the limits and the idea that a person can be a thing and literature can be a thing. And I think we need a language sometimes, and we need to talk about African literature for different reasons, but I think we should always do that with caution and with a bigger knowledge that you cannot put literature into borders, and that writers and creative people will do what they want, when they want, how and where. I love, some of the writers I love the most write in languages that are not their mother tongue, or set their books in places that they've never set foot in themselves. But think of creativity, has J.K. Rowling been to Hogwarts herself? Does that place exist? So when we're not in the realm of something that only describes. When we're writing and creating and making, we're in the realm of something that imagines and makes stuff up. And I think that's important. So in terms of me, for sure, the kind of experience I've had bears a huge has a huge bearing on how I write and how I go to create. And the way I write and create is I do what I like. I don't try and fit within the borders of what people think a writer or a writer based in Africa or a writer from Africa ought to do. And I think there are a lot of problems with that. There are ways in which we expect a writer from Africa to do, write about your wars and write about your, and of course, write about whatever you want. But the problem becomes when it's a stereotype and an expectation. I have had editors say to me, "Oh, we're not sure we can publish your work because we don't know how to sell it. We don't know how to sell it because it's not of a type." Now, when you have an industry giving you that kind of message, then we're in trouble, I think.
Grazie, Wanda Motoso.
Thank you very much, Yewande. Actually, you've just given us the perfect definition of what we've been talking about. Literature should not be constrained within a geographical space. And Yewande quite rightly says that she doesn't want to be boxed in. She doesn't want to be in a pigeonhole. She wants to be free to write as she wishes and write what she wishes about. I would like to say a few words to introduce Esperanza Hakuziwamama. She's written her first book, Manifesto of an Woman, and she's about to publish her second book. And in the second book, Language Matters. I'd like to ask Esperanza to talk about her relationship between writing and literature, which is not just in books and to be sought in books, but rather I know that in your work you meet many people, and on Instagram you obviously also show how literature is a way of engaging in self-reflection and exploring the present. I know that you're an avid reader, and surely you'll be able to I don't know, share some thoughts on how we can explore and share our black holes and use writing and words in media other than books. So, as a avid reader, as a writer, I wonder if you could tell us how we can know the world through literature. And I'd also like to ask you to explore the concept of listening to others and using words also to understand others. Thank you very much. Good morning, all, and thank you very much for this invitation. I am here to learn and listen because it is fundamental for me to make the most of this extraordinary opportunity as a person of African descent and as a writer. And I would like to start by talking about the interpreters who are doing an amazing job. And I'd also like to thank translators who've supported me. Without translations, work in translation, I would not have been able to read so many authors. I began to read when I understood that my education was based on a certain type of Eurocentric white literature, to use a common definition. And when I tried to take stock of the situation and asked myself, where are the other voices? I began to look further afield, and this has given me an opportunity to grow and to broaden my vision. I've always said that books have been my family, my education. They've enabled me to grow. They've enabled me to be what I am, and imperfect, but slightly more complete human being, also thanks to my personal history. I was born in Rwanda in 1991. I lost bits of my identity along the way, and I've found them again thanks to words, and also, as others have said, it was also about sharing my words with others. I was fascinated by the remarks that were made earlier on the idea of African writers that we have. I'm actually reading Kizzy Lehman, an Afro-American writer, who does ask this question: what does being a black writer mean? In Italy, this is a very lively debate, in fact. And Ijaba was saying, quite rightly, that in Italy, publishers need to have a really inclusive vision. Well, I must say that I'm very lucky, of course, because my first novel will be published by my favorite publisher shortly, and that means that I've made huge progress. But before achieving this, for me, it was fundamental to work with the world that surrounded me: streets, neighborhoods, people, lives. And this reminds me every day that I'm a minority as a woman, as a black person. But I have tried and constantly try, despite the anger, despite the pain, despite the difficulty, I try to turn this into something different. And I want this pain and struggle and anger to be shared and to be transformed into joy, because the most important thing for me is to be a writer who can write about beauty and joy, which is linked to my body, to my history, and to all the community of African descent. Thank you. Well, we were talking about transformation and literature and words and how they enable us to transform what we have, even wounds that can turn into something of beauty. And now Deputy Minister Marina Sereni has an extremely difficult task, that of trying to conclude our morning. It's a tough task, and I'm happy to be able to hand it over to her. Actually, I'll explain that Jean-Léonard Touadi will be speaking later. I actually have another engagement at 12:30. I will stay as long as I can so that I can listen to my friend Jean-Léonard Touadi. I'm not going to actually be drawing any conclusions. That's his task. The ball is in his court. Ambassadors, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I too wish to thank you all for having come to the Farnesina to celebrate together Africa Day 2022. Together, as was rightly mentioned by Minister Di Maio. In particular, allow me to thank the writers who have joined us today for their very insightful and comprehensive, let's say, debate on African literature and on their experience. Personally, it was a joy for me to be able to attend this very stimulating conference, and I've listened very carefully to the various speakers who have explored very complex issues, as was quite rightly pointed out by the two experts who opened our session. And this event has enabled us to focus on an extremely important and evocative form of art, literature that is, and it has enabled us to explore a broad range of very relevant topics, politics, social issues. We've talked about literature, society, gender issues, identity, dialogue between cultures and language. The successes, quote unquote, of African literature over the last few years, however, show that the continent, African continent, is in fact making great strides in all areas, especially culture. As Ms. Piaggio said, this is nothing new, and this is not an unfamiliar course, which actually began decades ago, thanks to which African literature has been able to gain the international recognition and resonance it deserves. The image we have is that of a continent which experiments, which innovates, which grows in an area which is not normally taken into consideration when establishing development indices, but it does have an impact on GDP, on well-being, on education, on the circulation of ideas, on the empowerment of women, and on, let's say, this, I really cannot but thank those who've shared their stories and their experience with us today. As to content, the work of African writers or African writers of African descent enable us to look at things in a different way with a different set of eyes. And I'm referring to our view of countries, history, themes, as was pointed out in the interview with the writer Mohamed Mugarsar. And this means that we can question, let's say, stereotypes, and this can really lead us to make some very profound considerations. I would also like to say that I greatly appreciated the contribution made by African writers who've chosen Italian to express their creativity, or rather Italian writers, as Ijaba said at the beginning. And this is a further proof of the fact that diasporas can contribute to the progress of our country in an area such as literature, which matters particularly to Italy. A few days ago, actually, I was at the Turin Book Fair, and this was a thrilling experience. I mean, I was giddy at the end of it, and I was listening very carefully to what you were saying and thinking that this was actually what the Turin Book Fair was all about. And maybe we should do more to, let's say, ensure that the Turin Book Fair could take on board the themes that we are discussing. As you know, Italy is a key partner of Africa, not only economically and politically, but also in the areas of social affairs and culture. And we very much believe in the people-to-people relationship, which has always underpinned Italy's foreign policy and cooperation policy. And we obviously know that the literary contribution of members of the African diaspora in Italy also focuses on the issue of cities. And this reminds me that I should mention something that was already mentioned by the minister. Italy has decided to submit its candidacy, the city of Rome, to host the 2030 Expo, and the theme is People and Territories, Urban Regeneration, Inclusion and Innovation. It's not just a headline. It's not just a title. We really believe that the time has come to make the most of the opportunity to regenerate our communities. The twin transitions, the green and digital transition, mean that we have to include social dimensions. Africa has a strategic importance for Italy in terms of security, social economic development, mobility, and nobody can question this, and it is in fact becoming increasingly important. Our partnership with the African continent in the broadest sense of the word, from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, is particularly important at the moment in order to enable us to face global challenges. Italy is committed to strengthening the dialogue between Europe and Africa. This is one of the priorities of our international action, as was formulated in the strategic document Partnership with Africa, which we are in the process of updating, also in the light of the experience we've had over these last few years as founding member of the European Union and as privileged partner of many African countries. Italy is always ready to cooperate with the continent to tackle together the key challenges lying ahead. in addition to the significant consequences of climate change and COVID-19 pandemic, African economies also been affected by the war in Ukraine on account of growing energy prices, as mentioned by the minister, growing prices in terms of fertilizers, food, and we know that food security in Africa is as we know, at risk because of difficulties in supplying wheat. Italy intends to strengthen its cooperation with African partners in this area as well to tackle this criticality, as confirmed at the end of the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Berlin, and before that the Declaration of Matera of June 2021, when the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Development of the G20 undertook the commitment to reduce poverty, promote food security and sustainable food systems. I would like to end here, once again, expressing my commitment on behalf of Italy to continue supporting the growth of Africa, to share our experience and strengthen our mutual relations is fundamental for our mutual benefit, so that we can walk together side by side towards progress and prosperity. And I would like to conclude, before I hand over to Jean-Léonard Touady, I really and truly wish to thank you, because this debate this morning shows that behind political strategy, there are people, and culture and literature can really encourage us to improve our performance in terms of foreign policy, thinking about the rights of women, youth in our countries, in your countries. There's so much more that we can do together. And because of that, I wish to thank you for having really, in a very significant way, celebrated together Africa Day. And for this, I also like to thank Director General Mistretta and all of his staff for having made this event possible. Thank you. And I would like to hand back to our moderator. Thank you.
Grazie, Vice Ministra.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, for these two expressions, walking together, and the people behind these strategies. And this gives us an idea of all the efforts that there are behind these events and these commitments. Jean-Léonard Touady, you will conclude our session with two questions I have for you. And the first brings us back to the first interventions that we heard from our speakers on this label that is used in the label of an African writer, African author, that is then used when awarding. Do we need other definitions, other descriptors to encompass all these cultural aspects and heritage, so that all readers, not only the Western population, can have more access to these authors? Thank you. I would start off by thanking the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Ms. Marina Sereni. I would like to thank Madam Ambassadors and ambassadors present, and all the writers present here this morning. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and thank you for the spirit of authenticity that you have in expressing your ideas and in writing your novels. And I would like to thank Director Mistretta for organizing this event. And I would also like to thank all the young people that are present here this morning. I see many of you. I think that the many messages that we have heard this morning are all messages that are encouraging for the future, a future that we must build together. I will answer the question, which has partly been answered by some of the authors this morning. Sami Chak mentioned the aspect, the issue of marginality of African authors in the Western cultural environment. It's almost as if they have to beg for fame, even if this, because this fame is being taken away from them, because this fame should actually be natural and naturally recognized by their readers. Yawande Omotozo also mentioned that we cannot limit the complexity of a writer in a with a label, with an whether it's whether it's African or Italian. Writers have this gift of being able to describe an imaginary world, and writers hate boundaries because boundaries push back, boundaries ask for passports, ask for visas, ask for identification. Writers hate borders, but loves living along the border, because borders are uh, a way to bring together different cultures and different people. And at the border, you are able to visit new worlds and cross into new countries and cultures. And writers love just that. And open their doors to the world. I heard our Tunisian colleague, our Tunisian writer, who said that I love to write because I want to create something new, something else, something that goes beyond, something that is desirable, something that exists, the reality of life, but something that goes beyond that, sort of utopia that we can create that goes beyond reality. And writers do just that. They do that through words. They lead us into an imaginary world, a utopian world, through words. And we mentioned African cultures and diasporas. There's always been this element of diasporas in African literature. If we talk about the Pan-African literature in the earliest centuries, Marcus Drayev and Dubois, if we think of authors that uh, built the foundation for African independence, and there's always this uh, element uh, of a strong element of the diasporas. So we have to talk about authors of the Africas. I come from Congo. Congo is the homeland of many important authors, and Ori Lopez, for example, wrote a book on the creators of Africa and African literature. And African literature bends language, whatever language it is, into new horizons that can lead back to the motherland, Africa. So bringing back to Africa, leading back to Africa as um, a source of inspiration. But then we know that language is a living element. Language changes, it's alive, and Africans have always been able to open up and absorb, take in what the Western world has offered. They don't just take, but they also give back, and they adapt those to an African culture. There's also a Creole literature that is the result of a cross insemination of all our cultures. So writers are important. African writers are important because Wale Soyinka said that they are the seismologists that register the movements of that occur in the core of the earth. If you want to know what is occurring in a city, if you know what is happening, if you want to know what is happening in a country or in a continent, read their poets, read their writers, because that is where you will be able to grasp what is happening, what is occurring in society. And that is the crucial role, the prise de parole of writers that allows us to discover this new dimension of this new world. Italy, from this point of view, should consider these writers as a gift. They are the epiphany of novelty. For Italian culture and literature, of course, is very important to Italy, to the Italian culture. Italy is everything. It's a combination of all these different cultures and all these different literatures. Italy is a laboratory of pluralism and of culture. It is rooted in plurality. So delicious fruits, literature is delicious fruits, and the writers are delicious fruits and gifts that should not be marginalized. Thank you, Jean-Leonard, for these closing remarks. And you mentioned begging for fame. At the beginning, writers shouldn't be begging for fame. They are describing what is happening at the core of our world. So I would like to end by asking you, because we mentioned a series of difficulties and problems that writers have, and overcoming this flat, um, bland vision and opening up to plurality along the border you mentioned. What type of future can we imagine for ourselves, and what should we all be doing together to create a society and a culture that includes literature? I will be very brief in answering your question, and I would encourage you all to read, and this is homage to Senegal, who has the presidency of the African Union. I would encourage you to read Chek Amukane. He wrote a book called Ambiguous Adventure, an exceptional reflection on relations between Africa and Europe. This is a novel that talks about the eruption of Western schools in a town in Senegal, in a city in Senegal, and people had to decide where to send their children, whether to send them to a traditional school or to the new school, the school of those who won, so that they could learn from the winners the art of winning without being right. Africa tried to learn from the winners how to win without ever being right. But the morale of the story is that we don't have the same past, but we will have the same future. Che Kamidou ends his novel with this phrase, and with this message. And so the future of a Euro-African space is something I strongly believed in, something that we must all work for through literature, especially, to create this Euro-African space, to avoid drifting apart, the drifting apart of these two continents. And I will end by quoting another Senegalese writer, Léopold Sédar Senghor, who spoke about the Mediterranean as the new ideal where the meeting point of the universal would take place. Taking and giving would take place in the Mediterranean, where three great cultures, Arab, African, and Greek Roman cultures, would cross-pollinate in the Mediterranean and would create the civilization of universality. The Mediterranean is nowadays an uh, an open water cemetery, a never-ending cemetery, but we need to give this renewed sense to the Mediterranean for the creation of a renewed Euro-African space. And this can only be done if this universality that Senghor talks about isn't an imposition of Europe, but a true universality that can lead all those involved and engaged towards a new future. I think that is something that we must deliver on, and we must build these bridges so that Africa and Europe can be closer than ever. Thank you.
Penso che non potessimo scegliere parole migliori forse per concludere.
I couldn't have chosen better words to end this morning. Before leaving the floor to Director Mistretta for his closing remarks, I would like to thank our esteemed guests, our writers who've been with us this morning, ambassadors, kind guests, and the interpreters. In particular, I would like to thank the interpreters for their work in translating Pap and Dante. I would like to thank Deputy Minister Sereni for joining us, for having joined us all morning. We celebrated this in this room, the conference room, Sala delle Conferenze. We celebrated Africa Day, African culture, African literature with all our guests, our writers, Veronica Fernandez, to all the writers who joined in and followed this conference, and I thank the ambassadors for being with us this morning, and we were able to celebrate today Africa and Europe. I would also like to thank the team that managed the organization of this event. I would like to thank Raffaella Campanati, Giovanni Ficarelli, Francesca Giovannini. I'm sure you have spoken to her on the phone, and I thank them dearly for their hard work. Thank you, and have a good day.